All right, next up is our first panel of the summit. We've been talking about weather data. Weather has been on everybody's mind this summer between the 70 plus days of 100-degree or greater heat and drought conditions. Our next panel is going to explore that drought from a variety of perspectives. We have John Dupnik moderating our panel. I'm going to invite him and his panelists up to the stage. John Dupnik is the Deputy Executive Administrator at the Texas Water Development Board. We are down one of our panelists, unfortunately, but we nevertheless have a star-studded cast of these four who are going to come up and join us. So let's welcome this panel to the stage.
Yeah, that's fine. And do you have the power?
He has
I'll sit on this end.
Okay. I'll make sure they get it.
Okay.
And then it's the big green button.
Okay.
You want to sit down first?
Yeah.
And then we do have that slide presentation for this one. Perfect.
We're distracted by the chairs.
Yes.
The ADD kids.
Okay, folks, just a little bit of patience. Appreciate a minute while we get things situated. And my eyes, my glasses. Okay, well, good afternoon, folks. My name is John Dupnik. I will be the moderator of this panel on managing groundwater in drought. And man, how topical and how relevant, I'd say. And actually, it was some months ago, because Leah's team is way ahead of this when they're planning this conference. And so some months ago, she contacted me. She said, thinking about having a panel on drought. You know, at the time, the drought intensity wasn't all that bad. But I was thinking, end of August, Texas, it's a safe bet. Let's go ahead and plan on this drought panel. And sure enough, the climate turned up the gas. It's gotten pretty hot, pretty intense. Precipitation has really dropped off. And this is more relevant than ever. And I think we're all feeling it. And also, it's been a lot of traction in the press here lately on drought conditions in Texas. And at Texas Water Development Board, we've got a service that sort of clips all the relevant articles, and we get sort of a summary of it. In the last few days, it's just been nothing but drought curtailments, utilities losing water, water restrictions kicking in. In fact, Texas Monthly just put out a big article, which I'll confess I've only skimmed, but I'm working through. In fact, the New York Times have just put out an article on groundwater pumping in the entire country. Texas didn't get a lot of attention, but nonetheless, it's front of mind for lots of us. So what we're going to do is we're going to dig into it with this esteemed panel here. I'm going to start off, we'll go through introductions, and I'll give kind of a primer on what current conditions are, and then we'll get into some Q&A. So start off with panel introductions. So to my far right, your left, is Kody Bessent. He's the CEO of the Plains Cotton Growers, and he's also not a stranger to groundwater districts. Many of you know he worked at High Plains for some time. So Kody brings that unique perspective to the panel. Then Charlie Flatten, General Manager of the Hayes Trinity Groundwater Conservation District, kind of the epicenter of drought, I'd say, in a lot of different ways. And Jacob's Well, you probably read, is getting a lot of attention. So Charlie brings the perspective of what I call a practitioner of groundwater management, a GCD manager. And then Amy Hardberger, Director, Texas Tech Center of Water Law and Policy. And Amy's a rare bird too, because she's also a licensed geoscientist, so she gets to apply that combination law and science brain to this topic. So with that, let me dive into if I can drive this thing. Why is that always happening? Okay. All right, just a little primer on sort of current conditions and where we are. And this is data that comes from the U.S. Drought Monitor. And while I'm thinking about it, a couple quick plugs. Please check out Water Data for Texas. It's Texas Water Development Board's all things for water data, great access to a lot of information, including the Tex Mesonet. The U.S. Drought Monitor presents this information, but they do a good job of summarizing the conditions. But I caught myself thinking about, this summer feels really bad, last summer felt really bad. How the two compare? And sure enough, they were two very intense droughts that came on pretty quickly. And I think they're both classic examples of a flash drought. But the map on the left there shows you conditions as of August 9th of last year at the peak conditions before we had sort of extraordinary August rainfall that gave us some relief. And at that point in time, there's relatively wide distribution of D4 or exceptional stage drought. And in fact, at that point in time, there's 29% coverage. And going back through all this material and look at the U.S. Drought Monitor's methodology, it was telling to be reminded that D4 exceptional stage drought truly is intended to be exceptional. It represents the only 1 to 2% of the extreme dry years of the hydrological record, and that's really what we're looking at here. The 1 to 2% of the driest years that this forms that baseline. So exceptional truly is exceptional. And then of course the map on the right is the latest product of the U.S. Drought Monitor for current conditions in Texas. This is as of August 22nd. And what's remarkable about what this reflects here is the difference just from the week prior. D3 and D4 drought increased by 18%, and as of the 22nd, 12% of the state was in D4 exceptional stage drought. And you see that sort of big, angry red bullseye right in the middle of the state. That's been pretty persistent for some time, and Charlie's probably all too familiar with that condition, and we'll get to that in a second. But two really extreme summers. If you're feeling it, and it is in fact pretty dry, pretty hot. So I wanted to really test that hypothesis because we're in it, and it feels really hot, dry, and most of us just sort of check ourselves by saying, this is Texas, this is summer. It's always hot, it's always dry. But in fact, when you look at the conditions relative to normal, and in this case, normal are data from 1990 to about 2020, so a fairly recent 30-year period. In fact, a percentage of precipitation relative to normal conditions is actually quite low. It's quite dry, with most of the state sort of less than 50% of normal, and the deep red representing 25 and in some cases 5% of normal. So this is the two summers again. So this is July, the peak of the drought conditions back in 2022, and then more recently, this period since the rains dried up in June, those rains that helped out the panhandle so much. Since then, it's really peaked, and we've got a very similar pattern here in terms of the deficit relative to normal precipitation. Same with temperature. If you're thinking, man, this feels really hot. I know it's hot in Texas, but it feels exceptionally hot. It is. It's in fact quite a bit hotter than normally what we would experience, and that's what these maps represent as well. Again, last summer, these warm colors, the orange and the red colors, represent from 4 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit above normal temperature, and then of course the current drought that we're in, also very intense heat that is a factor in the current drought conditions, with the red again being as much as 8 degrees above normal temperature. So if you're thinking it was hot and dry, in fact, it really is. What the effect on our reservoirs and our groundwater resources, it's not a surprise that you would see that impact. This is a map of total conservation storage data. This is all the major reservoirs in the state of Texas. It's a great metric for the impact on our water resources. And the circle that I've captured there, those are the summer months for 3 years. The bottom line, the pink line, is the benchmark year, 2011. That's the single most intense drought year within Texas for most of the state. And then the two bars above that, one represents last year, 2022. That's the light blue just above the pink. And then the next darker blue line is current conditions, 2023. And you'll notice they're following that trajectory that you might expect when you have really dry conditions, really hot conditions. The reservoir operators are pulling off of the reservoirs, depleting the storage as they're designed to do, and then there's no inflows to replace it. So that's no surprise there. That's what you would expect in an extreme drought condition. And then I felt obliged to bring up the J17 hydrograph. This is, of course, we're in San Antonio, and they're feeling some extreme conditions as well. These three plots here represent 3 years. 2014 was the peak of the 2010 to 2014 drought. That was a really bad one. And that hydrograph is represented there. And that sort of lingered over time and built over a much longer time period. 2022 is represented in that the blue. That was last summer. Again, flash drought. Conditions really stressed the aquifers, really stressed the ability of the aquifer to receive recharge and also demand. And then the very dark line, the blackest line, is the 2023 conditions. And you can see that as of just past August 12th, the J17 well was flirting with stage 5 drought conditions. And that's the deepest condition that I'm aware of and requires the deepest level of curtailment. So this is just kind of a primer to sort of set the stage. When Leah predicted this some months ago, I don't know if you take the blame on any of this, but it is Texas, it is summer, it is hot and dry, but these are some pretty extreme conditions that we're experiencing. So drought is a very relevant topic, I would say. Okay, so that's enough yapping on my part. Let's get into it. So I asked the panel to sort of set the stage to think about the variable perspectives on drought, how we think about it differently. Drought affects people in different ways. So Amy, I wanted to start with you. In our prep conversations, you said that a lot of factors go into drought, but we need to think about how drought affects individuals in terms of their experience while they're in it. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, wow, that is aggressive.
Hot mic. It's a hot mic.
Sorry. It was like so excited to hear me that it was like, yeah, so I think that because of what we're seeing from a weather and climate standpoint, I'm seeing sort of a need to shift the way that we talk about drought. So, I'm not a drought scientist. I know there's a lot of different definitions, but here's what I would say from an anecdotal, what we're seeing over the last 2 summers is that it's not just the lack of rain that's driving these numbers down, right? So those of us that obsessively look at the Edwards levels, it is a combination, and I know San Antonio Water Systems has done some interesting data analysis on this, that it's really a combination of the lack of rain with extreme temperatures that's driving behavior. So in San Antonio, there's been a flurry of articles about this. We're seeing that people are not responding to our drought management cues and obligations the way that we have in the past. And so, we have to ask ourselves, why would a city that has years and decades of being a well-known conservation response town suddenly be pumping more GCDs than we have during a time that it's quite clear that we should not be doing this? We should be preserving because we have no idea what's going to happen the next year or the next year. And even if it does rain, we have a lot of new people coming, et cetera. And so the analysis shows that it's this instinctual, I'll use the word panic, which is me sort of projecting my own feelings when it's this hot day after day. And so, yes, part of it is financial. They don't want to sacrifice landscaping, but part of it is this sort of, there's almost this intrinsic need to do something. And I think that's really driving the pumping. So I think, and I'm talking about Central Texas, but I think we're seeing this around the state, sort of manifest in different ways. So as we think about how are we going to respond to drought, how are we going to respond to future droughts, the conversation really should be, how are we going to maintain long-term sustainability of groundwater when these temperatures are less and less uncommon or more common? How do we sort of manage that? So I think that's what I was sort of referencing in the call, although I may not be remembering right.
No, I think you captured it well. And so, Kody, I want to switch over to you. And talking about variable perspectives, you're really in touch with the agricultural sector, with the producers. You live up in the Panhandle. How is the perspective different when it comes to producers in the agricultural sector? I mean, farmers are always watching the clouds. I can't imagine a more intimate connection with weather and water, but how is their relationship to drought different?
It's interesting. It varies from day to day and from week to week, and certainly Ronnie and Danny can attest to this. But the unique perspective of this topic of how do you manage drought, and I was talking to a gentleman earlier, and he said, pray. And that really is traditionally how a producer can manage drought is to pray for rain. But we do try to look at perspectives, try to look at forecasting information on prep and planning and the economic viability of it. From a definition standpoint, we talked about this, a perspective of drought. I was thinking about this earlier when I was kind of coming up here, Ronnie, but on a cause of loss, which we have risk management tools through crop insurance, that we can manage some of that risk in the event of a drought. But on a cause of loss, you'll see it listed as excessive heat, high winds, sometimes drought, depending on what type of claim that it is. But that's kind of a unique perspective that a grower is looking at. But traditionally, we'll look at forecast models. So NOAA has a 3-month forecast and kind of try to depict and plan of what we're going to grow. If we're going to grow cotton, by example, if we're going to grow maybe a rotational crop or sorghum or wheat. And so it all kind of depends on that perspective. But the biggest thing is trying to keep everything in perspective. We are very heavily reliant upon rainfall now, especially in the upper panhandle and southern high plains. We are converting more acres to dry land or rain-fed than we do irrigated. And the reason for that is because we've learned a lot of different lessons. So go back real quick on your reservoir slide, and I'll give you an example. Yeah, right there. So you see in 2011, the red line, where everything just continued to creep down, down, and down. We stressed our water conditions and our water resources extremely heavily that year because we were trying to push and grow a crop. We learned from that very distinctly as a grower or as a producer. And that's why you see in 2022, where you get into August and it starts kind of creeping back up a little bit, just by an example. And the reason for that is we abandoned an astronomical amount of acres in 2022, more than we ever did in 2011. And it's because we learned that it wasn't worth pushing our water resources and losing some of that resource for future use. So that's kind of a mindset or perspective that we're gaining knowledge as we get into new cropping systems. We're adopting newer technology that helps us preserve resources through better agronomic practices, through regenerative-based ag. Ronnie and Danny are prime examples of that. We do more cover cropping, more rotations, and that helps us adapt and mitigate some of the risks that we're faced with drought-type conditions.
So just to clarify, these are surface reservoirs, right. And so, but the aquifers probably had a similar response. So Charlie, shifting over to you, now you're a groundwater conservation district general manager. I refer to you guys as the practitioners of groundwater management, and you're also in a unique situation because you're right on the edge of a corridor that's experienced some extreme growth, population, and demand, and some of that stretching out to the hill country, and particularly in your area. How does that affect your perspective on drought, rather than it just being the impacts of really intense temperatures and lack of precipitation, but what about the demands on the aquifer? How does that change? How does that affect the drought equation?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. Will you go back to the heat map that we all see weekly sent out by the Water Development Board?
The actual drought conditions?
Go back to the really ugly one. Yeah, that one right there.
Oh, that one, the angry?
Yes, the angry bullseye. So from the perspective of the hill country groundwater districts, of which I'm on the eastern edge of, we have this angry bullseye just to our west where we get all of our recharge. So that has been there for months and months and months, and it continues to grow, and I see that it's creeping further west, which doesn't do anybody further west any good, let alone us to the east. So we've got this real lack of rainfall that's accompanied by high heat, which evaporates whatever surface water happens to be on the land and dries out all the vegetation and soil. So if and when we ever do get rain, what we're going to have to do first is fully saturate this giant sponge that we all live on before any water can get down to the recharge features. Simultaneously, to our east, we've got the I-35 corridor, and our neighbors to our south in Comal County and Hays County are consistently over the past 10 years have been the fastest growing counties in the United States of America. So we have a tremendous population pressure coming from the east, and we've got this hot drought coming from the west. In the 1850s, that may have affected 4,000 or 5,000 people, but today it affects millions of people. All of these people are coming to enjoy the prosperity of Central Texas, all the way from San Antonio up to Dallas, and they're expecting there to be a lot of water there, and there just isn't. And so we've got a lot of folks moving in who are accustomed to green lawns. They're accustomed to turning on the tap and having whatever water they need, and the reality, I think in the near future, is that we're really going to have to do some belt tightening from a mental point of view on our newcomers to help them understand that this really is the edge of the desert. This is a resource that we're using quicker than is able to replenish itself. And if we want to continue growing at the rate that we're growing, we've got to change our mind about what our yards need to look like, and we've got to change our mind about what our backyard pool needs to look like. And sometimes these are very unpopular subjects to broach when you have somebody moving in from someplace that has a diversified portfolio. In my county, especially in the western part of the county, and to the west, there aren't any secondary choices for your water except rainwater, which frankly right now is not a great second choice. But I can't buy water from the Carrizo Aquifer tomorrow and have it piped up. That's a 10 or 20 year project to get a pipeline coming out. The further west you get, the faster that problem grows and the more expensive that problem goes. So from my perspective, it's a matter of, yes, we've got a drought. We've always had droughts. I'm a 5th generation Texan. I've got drought in my DNA. I know how to survive a drought. But you guys don't know how to drought, and the fact that we've got 100 times more people than we ever had before, that just exacerbates the entire problem.
Yeah, so we talked about variable perspectives on drought, and now you're getting into the next topic, which are some of the challenges that are unique to those perspectives. So let's stick with you, Charlie. And speaking of an area where you're feeling a lot of intense growth, pressure, demands on the aquifer, most of your big producers are utilities providing for that new growth. What kind of management challenges are unique to that situation, and how do you convince a utility to help you manage, to help reduce use, actually back off on the aquifer when we're in stressful conditions like this?
Well, we use the same tools that we use for our exempt wells, and let's face it, our exempt wells constitute a great deal, more than half of the use that's in our district. So whatever I tell my permittees, I also need to tell my exempt users, because they're pulling the same water from the same aquifer. We have a pretty robust education and outreach program. I'm always available to speak to any group that would like to hear me speak about the drought or about water conservation. We've got really good connections with the community who specialize in that sort of education. Additionally, the district has taken some preemptive measures in the high growth areas that are especially sensitive, that have spring flow that people are accustomed to and count on for economic benefit. And let's just say, for example, Wimberley, Texas has the Jacobs Well Spring. It is a source of pride and comfort and economic benefit to everybody who lives in Wimberley. Well, it's gone dry, despite the fact that several years ago the district set up a special groundwater management zone to manage water withdrawals in that spring shed more robustly than we're able to manage it across the district. So that groundwater management zone has done a really good job of slow the rate of withdrawal. It's kept water in the water bank account that we want to have for later. But as you pointed out, we have the variable of rainfall or lack of rainfall. And if we don't have that, then our bank account dwindles. So your question is, how do we manage? What's our messaging? Our messaging is this is a
what are the management challenges that are unique to your situation?
The management challenges that are unique to my situation at the Hayes Trinity Groundwater District is we may be the most weakly endowed groundwater district in the state of Texas with regards to our ability to regulate. So I don't have the ability to manage exempt wells like most of the rest of you all have. For example, I don't have the 10-acre minimus that most of you are able to work with. I don't have, agriculture in my district is exempt. So I don't have any ability to regulate those higher use folks that most of you all have. It doesn't seem like the legislature's in a giving mood, at least for the past couple of years, so I don't expect that to change. So we have to figure out different ways to meet our goals.
Yeah, and one other complication, particularly in an area that's growing that fast, is that districts really don't have much authority over the patterns of land use, the intensity of land use. Amy, a question for you. How is that, or how can districts influence land use, or how is that a factor in the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge factor, both thinking about the lack of authority that groundwater districts have, but also that counties have, particularly counties next to very fast-growing areas. So what we're seeing again in Central Texas is most of the growth within city limits and even ETJs is about maxed out. And so all of the growth is happening in these unincorporated areas. I drove out to Canyon Lake from San Antonio, and there's a way you can visually see this, and that's within San Antonio, there's a tree ordinance, and the minute that you can tell when you've left that authority, because new subdivisions, they've literally scraped every single tree off of the side of the hill, gone. So that's sort of something that we can all just see, and then we think about that from a land use, density, sprinkler systems, management standpoint. So even, I mean, I know there's a big push, as Charlie sort of alluded to, against municipal authority or local authority, but the reality is San Antonio, Austin, Lubbock, we do have drought ordinances and things that we can enforce. We can talk about how well they're being enforced, but at least we have that tool. You get outside these city limits, and that's where everybody, which, to the point that I think Charlie was making from a science perspective, is exactly where the recharge is coming from. So it's an exponential impact in our ability to rebound from a drought like this, in addition to the fact that it's simply more users. It's more unregulated users that are often, these developments are paving over, they may not be respecting or understanding the delicacy of some of these recharge areas. So I think embedded in your comments was the science of it, which is it's not just about how much we're pulling out, are we preserving, at least in the aquifers that recharge, that doesn't count as much in West Texas, but in the ones that recharge, are we even protecting the areas so the water can come back in? And I think when you talk about land use, that to me is one of the biggest impacts, is both not really being able to enforce any kind of restrictions, but also capping our ability, literally physically capping our ability to get water back in. So I don't have a great solution to that, because I think that I agree that the legislature is probably not going to make a move in that direction, but to me, those are the nails in the coffin that are coming in, that you can't reverse once that happens.
Okay, so we talked about the variable perspectives on drought, and we talked about some of the challenges that are kind of unique to your situations, ag, municipal, and then also the legal and the authority to manage land use. We'll switch now to talk about strategies that are effective and ways that you can respond to drought. So Kody, you've got experience working with producers, you've worked for a groundwater district. What are some of the effective strategies that districts can employ in situations like you, where you've got a predominant agricultural sector where groundwater is the principal source? What sort of strategies can districts think about that are effective from your perspective?
A few different things on that, I guess, that comes to mind. One thing that we've kind of seen over the last couple of years, especially going from 2011 to 2022, and I would attest that 2022 was worse than 2011. And the reason I say that is in 2011, we failed roughly about 68% of all the cotton acres in the Upper Panhandle, Southern High Plains area. In 2022, we astronomically surpassed that and failed 75%. And that has not only impacts on the producers, but impacts on downstream economics. So impacts cotton gins, impacts warehouses, impacts the economy as a whole. And so how do you mitigate that? What we came to find in 2022, there were some incidents where a producer was kind of put in no man's land, where they knew it was practically irresponsible to continue to irrigate and push that crop. But unfortunately, they were not able to get off of that crop. And so one thing that I think GCDs could be mindful of and help in that incident is be a resource to that producer and be able to provide them some, verifiable information or data that they could then provide to their agent through a request in a written agreement to be able to either get off that crop and conserve that resource, or at least mitigate it, be able to windshield wipe or move to half side of that pivot. So that's kind of one example that a GCD can certainly serve as a resource on. Overall, from a planning-based purpose, I mean, we are looking at adapting and adopting greater technology all the time. We were talking about it at lunch a little bit, but better seed technology. We can develop better traits that are more hardy and drought resistant. Now, we do have to have cooperation from Mother Nature. We can't simply grow a crop without at least a small amount of rainfall. But being more creative in our agronomic practices too. I mentioned cover crops or regenerative-based ag. When we do get these spotty showers or pop-ups, that we're physically capturing every bit of amount of rainfall information and rainfall usage that we can get out of that crop. So those are a couple of things. And then GCDs help monitoring that resource. You talk about enforcement or penalties. It's pretty difficult to tell a producer, honestly, that you can't irrigate your crop. I mean, it's just physically, that's their livelihood. That's what they depend upon. But they are very responsible in how they utilize that resource because it costs them money. That's what I think a lot of folks don't tend to kind of reflect on is they're not going to just flip a switch and irrigate as hard as they can because it's physically eating into their margin or their bottom line.
Yeah, so there's, I guess in terms of a strategy for responding to drought, stretching the resource, I guess from my perspective, there's sort of a soft approach where you just focus on outreach and increased awareness. Then there's a regulatory approach, and those are both tools in the toolbox. But Charlie, from your perspective, as a district manager, what can be done to really increase awareness? What can you do to really focus on making sure that the intensity of the drought's conveyed, that everybody fully is aware of conditions and what they can do?
Well, I think the education and outreach portion of the conversations is critical, and we have to do that 365 days a year. We can't wait for a drought to make that happen. We have to start talking about that months and months or half a year in advance. We know it's going to come. It happens every summer, almost every summer, and it's really regular. So let's talk about it. Let's help people understand it. We do a lot of outreach where we can, and it's maybe not as much as some of the larger districts, but we're out there doing it. Sometimes it requires some phone calls to the press to help people understand that natural resources are not bottomless, and if you want to have a spring flow in your small town or your big town or your city, maybe you don't need to use as much water at home because they are related, of course. And in our case, the press has really jumped on the fact that Jacob's Well is dried up, and we've been in the news quite a bit, and that has absolutely changed the mind of the major producers who were called out on that. And so it's ugly. I don't like doing it, but sometimes it has to happen to get real results. So that's how we handled that sort of thing. Get out and talk to the people, meet the newcomers. They're not used to living in the desert. They don't understand that this is a bottomless pit of water, and we really have to be careful. We have to conserve like an old German farmer. Yeah.
Well, and I guess I'm also curious about how you might utilize just science and data. And you mentioned, Kody, about technology and what producers are doing, but you guys have a robust monitoring program. You collect a lot of information. How can that be used as a tool to really illustrate some of these points like we've done with some of these graphics here?
Yeah, we have a very robust science team, and they do a great job of monitoring our large chain of monitor wells. We've got 70 monitor wells. Many of them are citizen science wells that we measure through one form or another every month. And we create heat maps similar to what we're seeing here on the screen that live on our website and that I send out to whoever asks for them. They really do a good job of illustrating where we are based on the baseline of where we should be. Those things, those heat maps, if you go to our website, it's on the home page, they really tell a big story. There are places in the county that don't have as much water use or are influenced by the Edwards Aquifer. that bleed water into the system, but mostly it's deep reds like you're seeing on the screen before you, and that wakes people up. They see the reds and the oranges, and they wonder what in the world is going on and what they can do to help.
So, Amy, a question for you. Is it bigger than an awareness issue? In other words, it seems like, to your point earlier, that there is an awareness, but there's some sort of primitive instinct to continue to use. And how do you address that? Or from a district's perspective, or maybe collectively, you know, all the communities and everybody that's impacted by a drought, but how do you address that when they're aware, but you're still not getting the response needed to manage a extreme drought condition?
Yeah, so I mean, awareness is always the beginning, right? And showing data, and I think some of these types of charts are very helpful. I mean, the one that showed the different groundwater levels, I mean, the people in this room are, you know, it's singing to the choir, but I would challenge people to think about, add 3 years to that, and where are we? And that's not remotely unprecedented for us to have. I mean, if this is where we are in year 2 or 3, depending on how you're counting, what is year 5 going to look like? I mean, literally, what are we going to do? And so I think it is awareness, but we do really have to think about tools. If we're limited in regulatory tools, there's some very strong business cases. I think this is a hard conversation that nobody wants to have, and I get myself in a lot of trouble saying this, but you know, groundwater districts, counties are really getting involved. I know, you know, counties like Kendall County are starting to really look around and think, what is this going to look like? They're getting pressure from the landowners that didn't want to hear about this because they're 5th, 6th generation, but now they're seeing the impacts. So I think meeting with developers and really starting to talk about, we need to do this differently. You cannot build home sites that look like they did 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We simply cannot manage it. We can't manage the additional pumping. We cannot manage the additional ground coverage, the impermeable cover. So we need some drivers to get folks to the table. And I would say, I think that really does also tie into something that Charlie's been saying a couple of times, which is, we've got to change the aesthetic in our head. And so we have a lot of folks that are hanging on to what they think their lawn might look like. I have not seen a lot of people enjoying their lawns green, brown, or otherwise when it's 106 degrees outside. So do we need to be watering them with drinking water quality water once, twice a week when this is the situation? So I think, you know, it's time for some hard conversations. It's time to bring businesses, people like developers that are not always sitting in these rooms to the table. There needs to be, at every level of government, sort of a unified front that says, yes, we welcome new people here, but it may not look like it has looked. And you're not going to come from California and think that it's going to look like the Bay Area in your yard here. It just can't happen. And so it doesn't mean that new people can't come, but it does mean that we're going to have to do some real shifting around. And other cities, again, in the desert have done this. Vegas has done this. Phoenix has done this. Really hard decisions. Nevada's doing some very interesting things with new developments now. So there are models out there for us. I think it's just a time to commit that we are in a transition process, and we need to have the conversations around that transition.
I recall my prior position when we were trying to manage extreme drought conditions. It became like at the neighborhood level, neighbor against neighbor, brown lawn against green lawn. In fact, some of them would adopt signs that said brown is the new green and stick it in their dead yard and point it at the green yard as if some shame would work a little bit. But I think you're right. It seems like we need to shift away from the British long aesthetic. But so when cultural change, which takes some time, doesn't happen right away, when behavior change doesn't happen right away, when awareness just isn't getting it done, Charlie, from the perspective of a district, do you feel like you have the tools in the Chapter 36 toolbox to impose regulatory authority, enforcement? Is that effective? I kind of know the answer already, but I want to.
You enforce and exempt well.
This is a great question, John. I want to step back, though, to your neighbor against neighbor. My favorite new sign is This lawn is not watered with utility water. It comes from a well.
Yeah, as if
Like,
the,
well, that just makes it okay then, doesn't it?
You get a pass.
You get a pass.
that's
Yeah,
magic water.
I'm not sure that Chapter 36 does the most complete job that we could use. Our board has instituted a permit moratorium. We are no longer issuing drilling permits, nor are we issuing production permits. That has been the case for the past 4 or 5 months. So we don't have, we're not giving any permit for new water until the drought eases. So that's something that when we start to get rain and we start to see some recovery in our stream flow and in our aquifers, we'll go back to issuing wells. But that's a pretty powerful tool, a total moratorium on non-exempt wells.
And Amy is the resident attorney on the panel. Do you feel like that's sufficient authority, that it's legally sound, it's strong? Could districts, what other options are available to districts when it comes to actually affecting as a regulator, acting as a
You're
regulator?
really going to get me in trouble today. So, I mean, I do think it's effective if it's the only tool that you have. I think that the underlying issue is the limit of the tools. I've written a lot and thought about a lot about what does Chapter 36 really say? And groundwater districts are supposed to prevent waste and protect the aquifer, and yet we've never had, to my knowledge, and I would love to be corrected, a single case that really tests what waste means. And I think the way we think about waste changes as the state grows and resources come down. So, I get it. Groundwater districts have very limited, it's not like they've got a bunch of money to just try out different, pay these annoying lawyers a bunch of money to try out these sort of annoying, novel claims. But there isn't a lot of room for them. And I think the exempt well issue is a big one. And I'm very sympathetic to true agricultural users. But my guess is if you did a hard inventory on your exempt pumping, a lot of that would not be really what we think of as agricultural users whose livelihood is really dependent on those exempt wells. I don't know, am I wrong?
And to be fair, the agricultural community has done the most
Agreed.
to bring down their usage over the past 20 years. So
I agree. And I think one of the things where ag gets a bad name is if you just look at total pumping across the state, it's a lot. But what they're, this gets into the valuation of water and the highest and best use of water. And we keep putting pressure on agricultural communities, and yet, I've seen some pretty interesting numbers about the most expensive crop that we grow is turf grass. And so if you're really thinking, so yes, maybe a city overall looks like it's using less, but what are we using it for? Is that water actually what's being used to its best and highest value use? And I do think there are some tools already in the law that would sort of help us if somebody wanted to push that forward.
And kind of y'all talked a little bit about curtailment or waste as far as, some of the credos of a district. Keep in mind, the original formation of a GCD was to promote conservation.
Yeah,
That was the original creed.
it's in the name.
It is. And so when we talk about this, think of it from a generational shift, whatever you want to call it. Most producers today that are my age or younger are very risk averse. They're willing to try a lot of new things. And kind of step out there versus some of the older generations. So, but the challenging part for that is the simple cost. And so, I know one by example, like with High Plains, they participate in the Water Development Board Ag Conservation Grant. That's a unique set of funding and tools that allows a younger producer to be a little bit more aggressive in adopting more conservation-based technology and implement that on their operation to conserve water and grow a crop. And it's a carrot, not a stick.
Right. Yeah, I think, can I just say one more thing?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I'm getting yappy. I definitely, I think that's absolutely right. And I would just say that thinking about water just as a sector, department is very dangerous because it is a shared resource. So in these areas where cities are co-located with agriculture, that adds another, kind of complexity where.
And my point on that, why can't you do the same thing for a city as we're looking at in agriculture where you have cost share programs to implement more water smart technology rather than using more of an enforcement-based technology, incentivize them to move in the right direction or help them if you can financially.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears. This is the last segment of our panel, and this is to where they get to wax poetically about lessons learned and what we learned from historical examples, and then also get out the crystal ball and kind of predict where we're going, how future drought conditions might really challenge our ability to manage the resource, particularly with growth. So I'm just going to go to each of you and ask the blanket question. So rear view mirror, looking back, what are some of the lessons learned from what we've experienced in managing past droughts? And then also crystal ball, what does the future look like? Is this the new normal? Is it worse? What are your predictions? So Kody, let's start it with you on the end.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, we learned a lot from 2011 from a rear view mirror standpoint. Just the fact that it's ludicrous to really try to push that crop beyond its means and try to conserve our water resources. That was a huge learning experience for most of our area, if not all of Texas. Moving forward, as I mentioned, we are converting to more of a dryland or a rain-fed based system that just naturally over time, because our resources aren't recharging as quickly as we need them to be. We're adopting technology as fast as we can, but keep in mind, by example, I mentioned seed technology. We continue to adopt better seed technology, but it takes 10 years to develop a single trait and take it to commercial viable market. So naturally, we transition over time. It just takes a little time to get there and a lot of resources to do it. But we will get there. In our part of the world, we will be one of the last places I attest to ever grow cotton in the U.S. And it'll be predominantly rain-fed at that point in time. And our water resources will be solely dedicated at some point in time, maybe not in my lifespan, to human consumption, basically. But our technology is great. It just needs to be more affordable and accessible.
All right, Charlie, looking back, lessons learned, and what's our future look like?
Yeah, in terms of lessons learned, I think that if I knew then what I know now, I would have appealed to the economics of how people can move forward. There's a couple of good examples. Hays County, the middle of Hays County is Dripping Springs, Texas. It has the most robust rainwater harvesting system set of professionals and tank farms that I know of in the state of Texas. Whenever I go out and talk to people, I appeal to their water independence and say, look, here's a way for you to get totally independent from whatever it is, that utility or groundwater pump that you need to rely on. You have the best set of professionals available to you, less than 15 miles away. They'll come out and they'll get you hooked up. It's expensive, but what's your property going to be worth in 20 years if your groundwater source is depleted? So make that investment now. You have to appeal to economics. Sometimes that's the only thing that will get through to people when they start thinking about their property values and what their property's values may be in 20 years.
So the water independence, I like that. So freedom water.
Freedom water.
All rainwater. Freedom water. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
We could brand it right now. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right, Amy.
Well, I think one of the things when we look back, and I sort of mentioned this earlier, is this can go on a long time. So we need to, and I think most groundwater planners that are here already think this way. When I talk to people that are not in the water world, it's, it always gets hot. I mean, you mentioned this in the beginning, and it'll rain. Maybe. I mean, sort of. We don't know when that's going to happen, how that rain is going to come. I mean, Charlie said a great thing. I was hoping you'd say it again on the call. That was sort of, he doesn't like, I'm going to put words in your mouth. He doesn't like the new normal additive unless we mean that new normal is, what did you say? Worse, getting worse?
I think the new normal is ever worsening.
Yeah, so it's not like this is the ultimate max and then it'll get better from here. So when we think about drought of the 50s, when we think about how we've responded in the past, I would just say don't forget the element of the climate is changing and there's a whole lot more of us. So what worked then, which was a little bit of a wait and see, wait for the rain to come, which is always going to be part of a drought program is, I hope it rains. We have to work within these new parameters and be thinking about this from a fundamentally different way. Most of the time I'm pessimistic. Like if you have nothing good to say, come sit next to me. I'm great company. But if I'm being optimistic, right, if I just take my own sort of pain away from it, the biggest changes in Texas history in how we relate to the land have come from these extreme situations. I just did a deep dive into the Dust Bowl, and you learn a lot about when it gets really bad, people start reassessing their values. I once said, somebody said to me, there shouldn't be sort of a hierarchy of water uses. And I said, well, when there's not enough, watch the hierarchy come in. I mean, this is a natural response. So I guess my optimistic self is I think this might start shifting some things and shifting it for the industries that don't normally watch this and have to react to weather-related events. So, but I do think the key to this is going to be in land use.
All right, that's all of our pre-programmed questions. I believe we've got some time for questions from the audience.
That's right. We have about 5 minutes for audience questions. I did have a couple come in on the Trusty app. Thank you, North Plains GCD, for sponsoring the app. Anyone in the audience, though, before I knock these ones out?
First of all, thanks to the panel. You've covered a lot of really important issues related to this topic and really big issues too. I have a fairly narrow question, and it goes to one of the things that has really griped me for a number of years. I'm interested in your perspective about this. I guess my question is primarily directed to Amy and to Charlie because it's related to municipal water suppliers and utilities. Do you think we have the right kind of drought contingency plans now in terms of their triggers? Most of these drought contingency plans for water suppliers, in my knowledge, are based upon reservoir levels or aquifer levels, water supply levels, and they don't trigger some of the more stringent drought contingency requirements until those supplies drop to levels that I think are pretty dangerous. Do you think we need to reevaluate those drought contingency plans and our triggers to take in more meteorological conditions or soil moisture or things like that? Because it often seems to me that by the time we reach a certain level of water supply and begin implementing or trying to implement some drought responses in terms of water use reduction, that it's really almost too late. Because if the conditions continue that have been in place for a long time, then those supplies are going to continue to drop at a precipitous level. I've noticed in a lot of the news coverage recently about drought contingency plans being put into place that even now, some entities are only asking for voluntary responses from their customers, even though we've had these conditions of high temperatures and very low rainfall for weeks or months. So I'm interested in your perspective about that.
Yes, I agree with Ken Kramer. For the record, I have two thoughts. One is absolutely, we're highly reactive, and this is particularly problematic in the face of groundwater loss where it's not going to get there. I mean, the Edwards is very lucky. It rains in the right place and it recharges quickly, but that's not true for aquifers across the state. And so once groundwater is dewatered, I think that's kind of the panic is when or how is it going to come back? So I think the challenge is, and there's been some of these conversations at San Antonio Water Systems, are we even looking at the right thing? Should it be heat related? Should it be, what would that be? So I think the new frontier in thinking about, and I would say just taking it out of drought response, but the new way to think about almost conservation so you can avoid these triggers or at least prolong them is to fundamentally rethink how we're thinking about it before the quote unquote drought begins. So I think extreme temperatures have to be part of that conversation because that's where we're seeing these massive increases in pumping and water use. It's actually a response to the heat, not the lack of rainfall. The other thing that I would say is, along those lines is really thinking about quote unquote, water conservation differently. I'm going to get myself in trouble. I think it's crazy in this area to ever bounce out of once a week watering. This is where we live. Why do I think that? Because exactly what we're seeing. The year before, San Antonio was out of drought restrictions, so we were seeing a lot of watering. And then when the drought hit, J17 was lower than it had been the year before. 2011 hit. Now we're paying for that. You know, the analogy I make is, you know, you can go buy a large screen TV because you think all the money's coming in. The money doesn't come in. You can just take it back to Best Buy and get your money back. That's not true for water. So the way we enter the drought, what the water's levels are when the rain stops, can have huge impacts on what it looks like 1 and 2 years into it. So yes, back to the yes. Charlie, I don't know.
I'll second that, yes. Yes, the sooner you start saving your money in your bank account, the longer you're going to have money into the future. So that's an undeniable fact. The problem we've got is that we don't really have any way to enforce any one of our permittees implementing their drought contingency plan. So what we do is we declare drought, and that's based on a very hard metric, and it's defined in rule. When we hit that point, we declare drought. I know many of you, I did a drought survey, a drought rule survey recently, and it's, you know, a lot of boards have some discretion as to when they go into drought in the groundwater world. We do not. We go into drought exactly when this condition is hitting this specific point. So I send that message out, and it's up to the permittee to start their own drought curtailments. I wish that I had more control over them, but frankly, I don't. So the payback at the end is, of course, fines for overproducing their permit, which doesn't help me. I don't need their money. I need for them to continue to have water. So my message is always go into drought sooner, get your system tightened up, and you won't have a large fine at the end of the year. I can't think of any more simple way to put it than that.
Yeah, I'll just offer up that a well-designed drought program at the district level has curtailments or triggers that start to tap the brakes early.
Yep.
So that you can avoid those conditions, so you can avoid something that's truly dire or a true water supply emergency. But there's an art to it, and there's a science to it, but then you need the response for it to actually be effective.
That's right.
You can get there, you can send up the flag, you can say it triggered, but if the response is not curtailments to meet the goal, then you're not likely going to get the desired outcome. So that's problematic. That's a challenge.
There's also something to be said for not starting too early and running around banging pots and pans together, and then you're Cassandra.
Yeah, the other thing is that if you send out the signal, we're about to go to drought, we're about to go to drought,
Then it's
too
not
early,
right.
Everybody gets a big drink.
Yeah.
I think that's the argument to almost not talking about it as a drought until you really, really, I mean, that it should just be an everyday thing. Keep it in the bank account as long as possible. Yeah.
Well, that is our time. Let's give this panel a round of applause.